All right, everyone. I am very happy that y'all have been able to join us here today on our webcast for FDA Regulation of Laboratory Developed Tests. We are in for another live, wonderful event of FDA updates and information in this space. I'm joined by my partner, Sam Bernstein, in Chicago. I am Royce. I'm a partner in the healthcare group at this firm based in the Chicago office. Senior Associate Allyson Maur, who's in our New York office, and both Allyson and Sam work with me on FDA-regulated issues. And then supporting us, but not present, is Michaela Enger, who's a healthcare associate in our Chicago office that gloriously and graciously put together much of this presentation along with us. We can go to the next slide. So, why are we here today? What are we talking about? Why does this matter? What is a laboratory developed test? There's the information on this slide about what is an LDT, and I can go into that and we can talk about that. It's kind of interesting. But at a base level, an LDT is, really a diagnostic device. I'm sure that most makers of LDTs would not want me to use the word device, but it is. And it's a device that kind of came out and skirts around in a permissible way some of the rules out there that have traditionally governed in vitro diagnostic devices. An in vitro diagnostic device being, a great example is a blood glucose meter. Take some blood, throw it into the device, get a glucose reading. An LDT is really a diagnostic test that is done in a laboratory using a laboratory-specific methodology. And because of that, and because it's used by the lab, it is able to get around some of the more complex medical device registration and clearance requirements that have traditionally existed. That's all subject to change in this presentation, though. And there were some unique exceptions that existed in New York State and Washington State, given the fact that those two states are largely doing their own thing and not necessarily subject to all of the CLIA requirements because their programs are considered to go beyond CLIA, especially New York State, which has its own approval program for some of these. And, we're really kind of at a crossroads right now where FDA has taken another look at LDTs and decided that, well, maybe we're not going to give them the amount of discretion that we used to in the past. And I think that that's largely a combination of where we're at with, some of the growth of LDTs and their use and the in-home testing settings and, where we're moving with diagnostic medicine. We can go to the next slide. So, 1976, Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act regulated to, amended to regulate medical devices. There's been a lot of on and off FDA enforcement discretion here, which we're going to get into. But, really, FDA has limited resources, limited ability to enforce in this space. And a judgment call was basically made at FDA saying, look, for laboratory developed tests, at the time they were being manufactured in a small scale, it was, manual read techniques, it was rare diseases, really focused on meeting specific needs within a lab. And FDA was like, look, given the controls, given everything around it, we're not going to say what it is. It's likely, I think FDA's position has always been that they're medical devices, but we're going to take a more hands-off approach. And, the change has really been, we've seen LDTs just go beyond this concept of being used in a small clinical setting in a hospital lab to, being part of large-scale operations for really complex diseases, being manufactured in facilities. Yeah, they're going to a lab. Yeah, they're getting read in the lab, but they're really starting to look more like IVDs according to FDA. And, I think what we saw in COVID-19 was some of the extreme need for rapid diagnostics and the delays and the enforcement discretion and the alternate approval pathways. COVID-19 was kind of the catalyst saying, what is going on with LDTs and what's going on with medical devices? Why is there not a harmonization? And why are LDTs not regulated like IVDs? And so that's kind of where FDA had this aha moment where I think it was really somewhat, my personal opinion, I don't have evidence for this, but my personal opinion is that during COVID-19, we're doing a lot of crazy stuff. A lot of things were happening. We're all trying to move really rapidly to get things on the market to diagnose COVID. And some of the tests that went onto the market were not really that effective. And I think that really kind of, at the time, FDA was exercising a degree of enforcement discretion. But, after COVID-19, came to a conclusion, I think that there was a secret meeting at FDA where they're like, it's time to rein this in. You can go to the next slide. So, when I talk about enforcement discretion, when we talk about enforcement discretion, I think one of the key things I remind clients in healthcare is FDA is not the Department of Justice. FDA is not the Office of Human Rights at Health and Human Services. FDA is FDA. It's a agency that responds and reacts to patient safety. It doesn't have the ability to enforce all of the rules out there that are either statutorily mandated by Congress or promulgated by FDA through notice and comment rulemaking. They make judgment-based calls on what they should go after and how they should go after it. And a lot of times that could be industry self-policing and coming up with things such as ISO standards, quality control requirements, ASTMS standards, or it could be FDA deciding that they're going to make a couple of examples of people and then dialing back the risk once they've seen industry acquiesce to a safer practice. And go on next slide. So here we are now, almost now, in the past a little bit, May 6, 2024, FDA publishes its final rule governing in vitro diagnostic devices, remember glucose meters, as laboratory-developed tests, or LDTs as IVDs. And the idea is that it's time for LDTs to establish safety and efficacy in a way that is commensurate with the way other medical devices have been cleared. For a long time, IVDs, have had to go through, full clearance, full clinical trials to prove their safety. Another example would be, OraQuick for HIV by OraSure. And, it's time for LDTs to get there. Admit that, it basically means that if you're a lab and you have an LDT that you're using, and that could be either you're selling it online or selling it to doctors' offices or practices, it's going to be considered, you're going to be considered, a medical device manufacturer, and your LDT is probably going to be a medical device. But, my colleagues will get into some of the exceptions there, some of the phases. In the world of FDA, not everything that is a final rule is final on the day the rule is, and there's also some ongoing litigation out there that questions whether or not FDA truly has the ability to do this. Flip to the next slide. Sam, you want to take this over?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Royce. Really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So as Royce mentioned, we have this new final rule, and it's phrased as a, quote, phase out of enforcement discretion. What does that really mean? What it really means is there is a phase in of all of the FDA requirements for medical device manufacturers, for laboratories that manufacture and sell LDTs. And this rule is focused on IVDs that are manufactured by high-complexity CLIA labs offered as LDTs that are used solely within the lab. And the reason that it's so narrow is that the FDA's historical approach has been, if you are marketing a lab outside of your lab or it's at multiple locations, you're already an IVD and subject to medical device requirements, and you're already a medical device manufacturer. And so the reason why it seems so narrowly tailored is the FDA's position is that anything that is more than this, if you have a test that you're not high complexity and it's being manufactured and doing all these things at multiple lab locations, they're going to still consider that potentially a medical device. So what is excluded from the scope of the phase in of the medical device requirements And these are, again, categories where FDA's position is, generally speaking, this is a medical device. You have to comply with all the medical device manufacturer requirements. So LDT is used in more than one lab. Tests intended as blood donor screening tests, HCTP donor screening tests. Those are human cells, tissue, cellular, and tissue-based product tests for infectious diseases. Tests to determine blood group and Rh factors. Tests intended for emergencies, potential emergencies, and threats under Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Typically, when there's some sort of emergency, the FDA may issue some sort of specific enforcement discretion, but generally speaking, the FDA's position is those are otherwise medical devices. And then the other important category excluded from this, and again, subject to full medical device manufacturer requirements, are direct-to-consumer tests. So all these categories have to comply with all the medical device manufacturer requirements we're going to talk about today. There are certain categories of tests that are not subject to all of the stages of this phase-in. And the FDA effectively determined that certain types of tests, because of maybe their risk profile or how they're used, don't necessarily have to comply with all the medical device requirements. I'm going to walk through these categories, but yesterday, and Allyson was going to talk a little bit more about this later, there was a rule that came out from FDA that has a nice table in it. It's guidance for small manufacturers, for small labs, but in it, there's a nice table that goes through each of these different categories of types of tests and explains which stages of the enforcement discretion and which medical device requirements are applicable to different types of tests at which points in time. So one category which remains subject to enforcement discretion is actively subject to these requirements are 1976 type LDTs. This is sort of the traditional scope of what the FDA originally intended when it instituted enforcement discretion on LDTs. So these are tests using manual techniques, not sophisticated technology, and a single high complexity lab using components that are legally marketed for clinical use. So FDA has indicated they're going to exercise enforcement discretion for those types of tests. For LDTs that were marketed by a lab prior to May 6th, the effective date of the rule this year, only some of the medical device requirements will apply to those tests. Those include stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So stage 1, and we'll get into the more details on this in a minute. Stage 1, after 1 year, medical device reporting requirements, complaint files, reports of pulling tests off the market. Stage 2, registration and listing with FDA, labeling requirements, investigational use. Stage 3 are quality system requirements, compliance with current manufacturing practices, and other requirements. So for LDTs that are on the market already prior to May 6th, those three categories will apply to those LDTs. Only part of the quality system regulations will apply, but those types of LDTs under this enforcement discretion will not be subject to pre-market clearance or pre-market approval requirements. So for tests prior to May 6th, FDA basically has said, look, we're not going to require you to submit a 510K de novo application. For LDTs in an integrated health system in a lab that are meeting what's referred to as an unmet need, the same standard of enforcement discretion applies to those tests, are virtually the same. There's some slight nuances in terms of the quality requirements that apply, but basically LDTs in a healthcare system for unmet needs will have to comply with stage 1, stage 2, and part of stage 3. Again, no pre-market clearance, and Allyson is going to get a little bit later into what technically is an unmet need. Other tests that are excluded from the scope of the phase-in of these requirements are human leukocyte antigen tests for transplantation, forensic use LDTs, which arguably are not medical devices, LDTs manufactured and performed within the VA or the Department of Defense. LDTs approved under the New York program, those are treated the same way for the most part as the LDTs that were on the market prior to May 6th or that are used within a hospital system for unmet need. And then also sort of fully excluded are public health surveillance tests. So these are the stages of the phase-in. So as I mentioned, stage 1, MDR, removal reporting and complaint file requirements go into effect in May of 2025, May 6th. Stage 2 goes into effect May of 2026 on May 6th. That's, again, registration and listing, labeling, and investigational use requirements. Stage 3, May 6, 2027. These are compliance with all the other quality system requirements that medical device manufacturers are subject to. There are some categories of those quality requirements that are not applicable to LDTs, but for the most part, major categories, CAPA systems, correction issues, compliance with current manufacturing practices are going to go into effect May 2027. The next stage, Stage 4, this actually is 3.5 years after rule publication date, November 2027, requires pre-market review of high-risk IVDs offered as LDTs. So again, because of the prior to May 6 exception, this is really only going to apply to tests that are developed after May 6, put on the market after May 6, 2024, are going to be subject if they're high risk. And then Stage 5 is implementing the same pre-market clearance approval requirements, so 510K de novo requirements for low and moderate risk LDTs to the extent that those LDTs would otherwise be subject to pre-market clearance requirements. Medical device manufacturers, some Class 1 and Class 2 devices, low-risk devices, may not be subject to pre-market clearance requirements depending on the category. But generally speaking, in May 2028, FDA does intend on applying pre-market clearance requirements to tests of low and moderate risk. So I'm going to walk through some of the stages here. So Stage 1, the FDA's goal in implementing Stage 1 is really to obtain information about potentially harmful LDTs through the medical device reporting requirements. They also want to hear about corrections and removals, and laboratories are going to have to establish a complaint handling and review process. Again, MDR requirements in Stage 1 and correctional removals, complaint file requirements are not applicable to these categories of tests. Again, this is more clearly summarized in the guidance that FDA issued yesterday. So I'm going to go briefly over what to expect over the next year as your lab is getting ready to comply with Stage 1. So manufacturers will be required to document complaints, investigate them, and determine if they require reporting under the medical device reporting requirements. What does that mean? So any complaints about the test, whether oral or in writing, have to be reviewed to determine whether an investigation is necessary. If someone complains that the test was inaccurate, you have to at least vet it to determine whether you need to conduct an investigation. Any complaint that alleges that the device failed or that the labeling or packaging did not meet its specifications has to be reviewed, evaluated, and investigated. So there's a bunch of detailed information you have to put into your complaint file about your investigation. And an important note is that if you determine that no investigation is needed and no investigation is conducted, your complaint file also have to include, and this is so the FDA can audit this, the reason why you determined no investigation was conducted and the name of the person making that decision. Complaint files also have to contain, there's a long list of data that you have to include whenever you get a complaint in your complaint system. Many manufacturers will purchase software systems or hire consultants to develop complaint file systems and typically work with attorneys to develop policies and procedures and obtain guidance on, when our issue is going to be reportable to FDA, which leads into the next one of what is medical device reporting. So medical device manufacturers, as well as user facilities and some other categories of medical device companies, are required to report to the FDA when they learn that a device may have caused or contributed to a death or serious injury, or if the device malfunctioned, and if it malfunctions again, it would be likely to cause or contribute to a death or serious injury if the malfunction were to happen again. So what does that mean? I think that is pretty clear. Serious injury, something that requires medical intervention to address, surgery or otherwise. But there are a lot of LDTs where if you get a false negative, it's going to result in serious injury, right? The patient, maybe it's an infectious disease, and it's a false negative, right? And the patient progresses and gets worse and needs medical intervention. Those may be MDR reportable events. And so what's going to need to happen, and you can either do this as the issues arise or in advance, is determined on an LDT by LDT basis of, look, if we have a false negative, if we have a false positive, do we think that this was likely to cause or contribute to death or serious injury? And then the time frame for reporting to FDA, if it is reportable, depends on whether or not there's an unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public. So if there is, those reports have to be made within 5 days to the FDA. You have to effectively investigate it and determine it's reportable within 5 days and then submit the report to FDA. If it doesn't involve a unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public, then you can report it within 30 days. There's also a specific category of events that are still subject to the 5-day reporting requirements. But what does this mean? So, for example, let's say you have LDT for an infectious disease that's very contagious, right? You get a false negative. Well, I think you could probably agree that there's an unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public if you have a false negative for a very contagious disease that is, deadly or creates real problems. So, again, this is going to require sort of an LDT by LDT analysis of, if we have false negatives, if we have false positives, what are the implications? Are we going to have to report it to the FDA, and how quickly we're going to have to report it to the FDA? In stage 1, there are also device correction and removal reporting requirements. So if you cease offering a laboratory test and to reduce the risk of health posed by the device, or if your lab test is in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that presents a risk of health, and you decide to pull your test from the market, then that has to be reported, even if the event was caused by user error. So if you're pulling products from the market, pulling tests from the market because of a risk to health, those are going to be reportable under stage 1. Reports generally have to be submitted within 10 days, but if the action is an actual recall, meaning that there was a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requirements, which typically would be subject to legal action by the FDA, then you effectively have to notify FDA immediately. Those are fairly rare, but do happen. Stage 2, and I'm going to briefly go through some of the other stages, but as you can see, there's a lot to do in the next year to become compliant with even just stage 1. Stage 2 are registration, listing, and investigational use requirements. So labs that are offering LDTs will need to register as establishments with the FDA, and will need to list all of their tests. Owners and operators of establishments are required to register with FDA, and you'll have to list all your tests. And then also in stage 2 are the labeling requirements. So this includes what's on the package or printed on the package, as well as package inserts. Anything that accompanies the test or the package information has to comply with FDA labeling requirements. And there are very specific labeling requirements that are applicable to IVDs that will apply to LDTs. In addition, in stage 2, there are investigational use requirements. What that is if you are developing a LDT, then you'll have to comply with the investigation device exemption requirements. When developing that test and conducting research with those tests, you may need to get an exemption and otherwise comply with the IVD requirements beginning in stage 2, which is again in May 2026. Allyson, I don't know if you want to take over here and talk a little bit about some of the quality system requirements
Sure.
in stage 3, which again will begin in 2027.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks everybody for joining us and sort of rolling along here. I'm going to pause, take a breath. We've got some time before we have to start complying with stage 3. So if you're in this bucket, you've got a little bit of time. We can help you get there. So stage 3, the quality system requirements. So what's really required here depends on what kind of test you have. Largely, the quality system requirements are going to apply. The more complex the test, the more the requirements are going to apply. Some of them, really the only thing that's going to be expected are the certain reporting requirements under 21 CFR 820. And for some of the more complex tests, it will be the more fulsome quality systems requirements. So currently, donor screening and direct-to-consumer tests have to comply. So we've got them included on this list because if you're making them, you should be aware that quality system requirements, you should already be complying with these requirements. When we're dealing with LDTs for unmet needs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the lab integrated into a healthcare system, it is within that healthcare system for those healthcare system patients only. Really what they're looking for is the records and the documentation. requirements under the QSR. Things like maintaining device master records, device history records, quality system records, and complaint files. That's the big ticket item here. FDA has indicated that generally speaking, they're not going to expect compliance with the other QSR requirements, except for also maintaining complaint files. So really they're looking at the records here. Same thing with currently marketed IVDs offered as LDTs prior to the rule publication. And then also with the non-molecular antisera LDTs. And then once we get into the more complex tests, the LDTs approved by CLEP, compliance will be expected, generally speaking, as with any modified device that's currently on the market under a 510K, and any IVD offered as an LDT within the scope of the phase-out policy, but sort of doesn't fall into the other targeted. It's kind of the catch-all other bucket. So effectively, the more complex your test and the higher risk of harm, the more of these requirements, the quality system requirements that you're going to have to comply with. And again, those are largely, it's the design controls, the purchasing controls, acceptance activities, CAPAs, record requirements. So really making sure that you can document the life cycle of your device and you document that, you know, the device works and this is what happens. We've got these controls in place. And this is going to be really critical. And it's not necessarily super directly addressed in the guidance, but when you're dealing with LDTs and IVDs that rely a lot on technology now, where you've got some AI built in, you've got some training built in, when you're changing your algorithm for how you're determining, you know, you really got to make sure that you're tracking those design changes. It's the same thing with, you know, as you change your test, if you've got a test that's on the market currently, and you're good, if you make any change to that test, you're going to have to go through this process. FDA has basically indicated that they are going to consider that a new test, and you need to walk through these processes. So keep in mind that things like algorithm changes or machine learning changes or technological updates may qualify as a change. We can do a whole separate session on FDA's regulation of AI and machine learning. But you know, just keep that in mind that anytime you change a test, we're going to have to come back and revisit and determine whether we're going to have to comply with a different set of regulations. Sam, you can go ahead to the next one. So stage 4, the pre-market review requirements. This again is really going to depend on the severity of the test, the severity of harm if there is a problem with the test. So this is our high-risk class 3 LDTs. These are very often genetic tests, tests to detect whether or not you're a carrier for BRCA1, BRCA2, tests for Huntington's, where the risk of harm for a false negative or a false positive is very high. So pre-market review is a little bit more of it's a much more rigid process. There's application process involved. You really have to submit lots of documentation. What's nice about this option, though, is if you've already made the submission before the stage 4 date for the high risk, you can continue to offer that test while FDA is reviewing. So you've kind of got this grace period. So certain categories, again, the unmet need used in the integrated healthcare system won't need to comply with this requirement. And I want to kind of asterisk everything that we've been saying so far this is under the current rule, the current guidance. FDA has and will continue to put a footnote on everything and says we also still reserve the right to make a determination for any particular test that they need to go through a process. They were still part of that enforcement discretion is if we think your test is risky or it's riskier than others in your class or we've received complaints, we may make you jump through all the hoops. So keep in mind that, you know, this is the current rule, but FDA has and will continue to reserve the right to determine that your test maybe is falling into a different category or may need to bump through some of the other additional hoops. So Sam, go ahead. Okay. So stage 5, FDA does not expect very many tests to fall into this category. This is the low and moderate risk class 1-2s that aren't otherwise exempt. So not necessarily genetic tests, not the real high risk guys, but you know, some specialized tests. And if a 510K or de novo submission has been made by stage 5 for a lower moderate, you can continue to offer. So again, grace period here. And you know, the stage 4 and stage 5 really reflect what FDA is thinking of. We're really concerned about the high risk guys, so we're going to enforce against you first. That's why stage 4 is the higher risk, stage 5 is the low to moderate risk. So they don't expect a huge influx here. And frankly, by May 2028, this really should have all shaken out, and you should know where your test falls, and probably may have gone through an application process already to sort of, make sure that your test is complying all the way. You're not waiting until, April 2028 to determine, oh, hey, maybe now it's time that we submit an application. So we've got this really nice, long, spread out time frame for some of these tests that maybe are kind of in the low to moderate. We have some time to get on board. 4 years, not forever, but it certainly gives you some time to work on developing your development plan too for any test that you might currently have on the market. And if you're planning some changes, you can start building toward these stages and these deadlines to figure out when you're going to have to submit. If we make a change to X, when are we going to have to submit, if we're going to have to submit to FDA?
And again, as Allyson said, there's some exceptions here. So I think the most important one is that anything that's marketed prior to May 6th is not going to be subject to the pre-market review requirements unless the FDA comes in, as Allyson mentioned, and raises a specific concern. So we're really talking about new tests that you developed since May 6th or tests that you modify after May 6th that are going to be subject to pre-market review requirements.
So Sam, let's go ahead and talk about New York. So LDTs and New York State CLEP. For those of you who have LDTs currently on the market and you've gone through the CLEP approval process, you know that New York State's CLEP, Clinical Lab Evaluation Program, is basically FDA light. New York is exempt from the CLIA requirements. Now, want to be careful here. CLIA regulates labs, does not generally evaluate the efficacy of the test. They determine the proficiency. Can your lab get the same results time and time again over when you're running a particular test? Can you follow the instructions? Do you get consistent results? Under New York system, and Washington State system is also exempt, but New York's is really the focus here. New York has been CLIA exempt for years. New York has had an LDT approval system running. And it's one of those things where they have really gone the extra mile. And FDA even said, as far back as 2014, they had released a white paper, which has disappeared from FDA's website, that basically indicated, look, we think New York's doing it right. We like their process. We might someday copy this process, because New York's CLEP actually validates the test. Does the test itself work? Does it do what it says it does? Does it detect prostate cancer in a urine sample? Is it consistent? So it's more than just regulating the CLIA lab. It's actually regulating the test. So they go through a full QSR process. You have to submit quality records. You have to basically most of, if not all of what's included in the 21 CFR 820, these quality system requirements under FDA are basically baked into the New York system. So in order to offer an LDT in New York, even if your lab is based in Texas or Ohio or California, you had to submit your LDT for full CLEP approval if you wanted to sell that test and test specimens from patients who are located in New York. So there has been this process. CLEP is very good at what it does. It's very thorough, and it's very, communicative with the labs who submit their tests for review and for approval. But it's a state agency, and they have limited resources, and they've been a little bit backed up for quite some time because they do such a thorough job. Now, FDA acknowledged in its guidance that, look, we understand that New York has been doing this, they're doing it well. We're going to cut a test that's passed New York CLEP's process some slack for a few years, but we also don't really want you running to New York with your test now to get it LDT approved so you don't have to play by the rules. And I think that was kind of the initial reaction from a few people in the industry was, okay, we'll just get CLEP and we'll be good. So FDA has basically said, look, We're going to enforce stages 1 through 3. So you have some time. So please don't run off to New York and use that as an alternate pathway. And from a realistic business perspective, also probably not the best choice, because New York is already backed up. And if you have a test that you're looking to get to market for an LDT, or you think you want sort of the approval to sell in New York, don't just run to New York just to get your LDT approved so you think you can delay some of the FDA. New York does not have the capacity to really handle an influx like this. They are not set up to be the backup FDA. And FDA has acknowledged it, and CLEP is still evaluating the new rule and sort of how they're going to handle it going forward. That said, if you've got a test that's in the process of approval, you know that it can be a little bit of a lengthy process. I have personally ushered a couple through the process that took over a year. Some others took less, 6 months. So it's not an alternate pathway. It looks like a great shortcut initially, but if you're not already in the process, you may want to reconsider just running off to CLEP as a backup plan, because you're still going to have to comply with stages 1 and 3. Sam, you can go. Okay, great. So LDTs for unmet needs within a healthcare system. That is a mouthful. I think this is one that's really been a concern for a lot of hospital systems. What does this mean? Why are we now included in this? Why do we have to jump through all these hoops? We've been testing this. We've got unmet needs. We're treating some rare diseases. And FDA acknowledged, look, we understand that a true LDT for an unmet need may lead to loss of access to certain care systems or to certain treatments. So FDA is going to exercise enforcement discretion for LDTs that are manufactured and performed by the lab integrated within the healthcare system to meet the unmet need of patients receiving care within that healthcare system. So kind of tricky. It needs to be basically the hospital or the health system lab that has developed this test and is meeting an unmet need, which has to do with rare disease, and we'll get into on the next slide, sort of what qualifies as unmet need. But this one's going to be a little bit interesting, because you've got some larger healthcare systems who have multiple facilities. We've got a very large healthcare system in California who has just recently purchased a very large healthcare system in Pennsylvania. If one of those two entities has their own LDT and it's for use within the system, is that, kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit of what FDA intended? Or did FDA really intend for this to be a small rural hospital who, out in Southwest Missouri, who, the nearest cancer center is 3 hours away in St. Louis? They've come up with this test, which really helps with a particular unmet need. Was that FDA's intent, that it really be these small one-off systems, as opposed to these large sort of conglomerated healthcare systems? So my 2 cents is this may get modified in the future. There may be some further clarification here on what FDA really meant as far as integrated within a healthcare system. Sam, we can move on. So the LDTs for unmet needs, what is that? So typically it's where we're looking at a disease where there is no FDA authorized test, and a hospital maybe sees, they're in a particular area where they're seeing an uptick in a particular disease. There isn't already an FDA authorized test. This kind of harkens back to the true 1976 LDT. We've come up with a way to test for something where there is no other test, or accommodating alternative specimen types. So typically you require one fluid to do the test, but you can't get it. So, can you run the test on a different, is it plasma versus whole blood? LDTs for use on PEDS patients. So a lot of the FDA tests, the LDTs and the IVDs may be approved for adult use, but may not be approved for pediatric use. So, there's a little bit of grace there that, okay, they can develop it for pediatric. LDT that's generating results in a significantly shorter period of time than an FDA authorized ICD. So we saw a little bit of this with, the EUAs and the COVID test. Initially, some of those COVID tests took an hour, then 30 minutes, then 15 minutes, then 5 minutes. So if if we need to be able to make a critical decision in that type of situation, or if they come up with a test that normally it takes 2 days to get a result, but if the hospital can come up with its own test that actually gets you a result within 8 hours, that's the kind of test where we're going to get some grace period. And then the indication, an LDT for the same indication as an FDA authorized IVD that's offered only in another healthcare system that isn't accessible to the patient. So again, a hospital in California has developed a test, or there's an FDA test, FDA approved test, but we can't get that test in rural Alaska. Can we come up with our own? Don't expect to see many in that category, but that's where FDA has also included this is an unmet need. And then emerging pathogens for which there's no FDA authorized IVD. COVID, as the next pandemic pops up, we will see more of those tests fall under this category.
So I just want to jump in here real quick. Y'all have been in great hands with Allyson and Sam, two of my colleagues, but I want to give kind of like a practical, takeaway on this. Like, these are all true, and everything about these is true. But if you're thinking of going into these categories or going after tests like this, really think about it from like a business perspective, which is like, well, how long is the emerging pathogen going to be there? Oh my gosh, I'm developing something for peds. Like, peds are very different kinds of patients than my standard patients. And, is the unmet need niche that I'm trying to take advantage of really an effervescent option, or is it just there for a little bit of time and then we'll go away? Because we try to find, niches of enforcement discretion sometimes when our instincts are to always find those. I think one of the key things Allyson was talking about is like, look, this is more of a traditional LDT. This is not something that you should think of as a scalable solution, but something that is, maybe time limited, specific area. This is not an exception to the exception to the exception for everything. It's really an example of, the small nuance still exists in the rule, but is not, again, another wormhole to travel down and, looking for exceptions around it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Royce. Again, this is within a hospital system, and this is not intended. And I think it speaks to FDA's focus on the high risk situations where, look, these are not intended to be tests that, are big money makers. They're there for a rare disease. They're there for a truly unmet need. And even in the emergent, at some point, you've got a test. Somebody has developed a test that the FDA has approved. So that emergent situation is no longer going to be emergent. So not intended to be a category where you essentially, are going to make billions of dollars in revenue from developing a super secret sauce in your LDT in your hospital healthcare system. Royce, you want to talk about litigation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, on the litigation side, we're seeing some, like, May 29th, 2024, this litigation is as fresh as it can possibly get. As someone who has fought the FDA and gone up against FDA and counseled clients in going up the FDA ladder of challenging under the Administrative Procedures Act, I give caveat emptor. Like, our firm can do it, and we are happy to do it, and we have done it many times, but you are looking at a titanic and colossal exercise of part constitutional law, part, challenging under the APA, and make sure that you go into it with a coalition of the willing, because the bar task can be quite big. So we've got a brand new case, American Clinical Laboratory Association and Health Track RX, challenging the final rule under the APA. Really classic, FDA, you didn't engage in proper notice and comment rulemaking. You didn't consider this. You didn't consider that. The crux of their argument, though, is that under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, FDA is engaged in essentially an unconstitutional overreach of their ability to regulate based on Congress's intent to regulate in vitro diagnostic devices no, is it in vitro, yes, diagnostic devices versus, and Congress did not include LDTs because they shouldn't be considered LDTs. And what FDA is doing, according to the plaintiffs, is they are making an illogical bridge between LDTs or IVDs and therefore medical devices, and then LDTs should be considered devices. And then they're making, so they're taking that argument, which is an overreach, like FDA don't even have the ability to regulate in this space anyway. Look at what congressional intent was, but then they're also going to the classic APA argument, which is like, hey, look, based on the comments you received, you didn't respond to them, you didn't adequately consider this, the regulatory framework chosen is illogical. And those are very classic APA arguments, and the challenge with an APA case is you are essentially fighting an agency that has unlimited resources, and you are then trying to convince a judge in the Eastern District of Texas, not an incompetent district by any means, but trying to convince a judge in the Eastern District of Texas that, you know, here's the law, let me educate you on all the law in this space, and this is why FDA failed to do that. And that is a Herculean task. It requires massive amounts of discovery. You know, for my clients, I hope they're successful. I hope that we're able to get traction here. Sometimes the goal of these lawsuits is really not necessarily to get FDA to like change the rule, but sometimes it's to get a national injunction. It's to get a delay, some compromise on the part of FDA to change an aspect of the rule, delay implementation. There's so many things that can come from this. What I tell most clients in these instances is like, interesting, we've got a case that could delay it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but realistically, we need to be not, you know, this is not a three-way parlay on DraftKings. This is a very much a, you know, we should really be thinking strategically about our LDTs and what we want to do with them and how we want to get them into compliance rather than, you know, it is a strategy. You can flood the channel with LDTs and then, you know, see if you get the injunction or not. But I think that it's interesting to watch. We'll keep watching it. We'll see what happens. I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't know if FDA was wrong or right. I think that there's a great argument for why LDTs should have remained as LDTs and not devices. But I also have seen the same structure play out time and time again, which is where FDA notices that an exception is swallowing the rule. FDA wants to regulate it, makes a very strong patient harm and risk argument. And unfortunately, you know, for better or worse, sometimes either Congress agrees, the courts agree, or, you know, FDA is able to hold its ground long enough until the plaintiffs back down. So interesting to be determined and decided, but I think the point of this webinar is not sports betting on cases, but really advising on how we get our products into compliance when facing down FDA.
So I think, Royce, what I'm hearing you say is that this isn't a slam dunk case necessarily. We don't know what's going to happen from this case, but there's not some sort of argument here that we don't have to worry about this rule. We actually do need to start taking steps.
Absolutely. I would not advise on ignoring this rule. I would advise on coming up with a phased compliance plan and then thinking a lot about FDA enforcement discretion. If we can't meet the goals of the rule, thinking about what a conversation with FDA might look like to, at least on a personal level, get our device where it needs to be on a time frame where we've either established discretion with the center or a field office. And, you know, like at our firm, we're happy to have those conversations and figure out what that looks like for your unique situation and what the strategy for compliance should look like.
And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's this updated guidance that came out yesterday, I believe. It summarizes the different categories of exemptions that we talked about today. It does have references to a number of the FDA regulatory guidance documents that begin implementing throughout the stages of this phase of medical device requirements. It doesn't really get into any new information if you read the huge rule, but it is helpful in terms of a breakdown of the chart and the requirements. I think practically, for laboratories that are currently doing LDTs, you have some quality system in place. You have processes in place for handling, allegations of false positives, false negatives, or other problems. Those processes are likely not where they need to be to comply with these FDA requirements. There's likely a significant gap between where your lab currently is from a quality perspective, from a complaint handling perspective, to where you need to be to comply with these medical device requirements. So there is a process here, and I think, as I mentioned also, some of these requirements are going to vary based on the LDT and what exactly you're measuring and how you're going to have to respond to complaints. And so you'll need to adopt policies and procedures and acquire systems to help you comply with the phasing of those requirements. And then I think labeling is also going to be, when that goes into effect in 2 years, going to become a substantial change and require a significant amount of work to ensure that the labels on your LDTs are compliant with FDA and IVD requirements. So that we're not quite there yet. You have 2 years there, but I think that when that comes around, complying with the labeling requirements, off-label promotion, all sorts of other related issues there, there's going to be substantial steps that labs are going to need to take to reach full compliance here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've really enjoyed being able to present this to y'all. Look, Sam, Allyson, and I have a great deal of experience. I hate to use the term staring down the barrel, but we've definitely been across from FDA in complex situations along with our clients. We've all dealt with industries that are under massive amounts of change, and we're happy to really advise on your unique situation and see, really as sort of a member of your business team, figure out a way to get your product either into compliance, find time to operate in new markets, or, what it would look like and what costs would look like to design or gear the product towards a different route of indication.
And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to take any questions offline that anyone else may have. Allyson, I don't know if you wanted to share any last thoughts that you had about this rule.
Yeah, no, I think it's been, for those of us who play in this space, it's been a little bit of a long time coming. I know I've been waiting around since 2014 to see if anything was ever going to happen with that guidance document. I think, COVID maybe exposed some weaknesses in the system. And to Royce's point, the exceptions started to swallow the rule. I don't know that this was necessarily a surprise for those who've been watching and paying attention, but I think we're, now that it's here, we're here to help everybody figure out how to implement, how to get through the process, and how to sort of position yourselves in a way that's compliant, and you can continue to market your tests in a way that you remain in FDA's good graces. And we know everybody on the call has good intent. We always assume good intent, and we're here to help with anything that you need going through this process going forward.
Well, thank you everyone for your time. We really appreciate it and look forward to hearing from you.